The numbers are generally higher on weekends. Each day, a jail population report is distributed to key court officials. Let's take a look at a recent typical day. Wednesday, May 16th. Next slide. Slide before that one. Okay. On May 16th, 2018, the total jail population was 1,682. Okay. Now we have here the racial breakdown. Caucasians, 371, or 23.8%. African Americans, 1,091, or 69.9%. 9%. We might as well round that off to 70%. Hispanic Latino, 149, or 9.5%. And then we have other, 15, less than 1%. So, who's overrepresented? Doesn't take much to figure out who's overrepresented. The numbers are extremely large. Now, look at the gender profile here. We have 92% male and 8% female. So, our representation, African American, males. Okay.
Good. Oh.
Now look at the age profile. Of the 16 to 17-year-olds, remember the 48,000 youths? Of the 16 to 17-year-olds, 54 were male and 5 were female. So, very young, we began that pipeline. Okay. The next slide shows the Mecklenburg County jail population chart profile. Okay. Notice that the majority are being held pre-trial, meaning they have not been convicted of the offense for which they're being held. On average, those charged with a felony are held 152 days pre-trial. How many months is that? 1 month? 2, 3? 5? 5. That's almost half a year. On average, these charged with a misdemeanor are held 37 days in jail waiting trial. Most are being held pre-trial because they do not have families that have enough money to bail them out. And each day, they are charged a $10 fee. So when they come out of jail, they owe money to the system. So, what is the profile of the person most likely to be housed in our jail? Next slide. 4. African American. African American males. 25 to 34, charged with a felony, awaiting trial. Stay, average stay,
Constitution, but really the Supreme Court decision never really was actualized. And so we're calling that out today, and that's why we have these panelists here today to give their own account of that Supreme Court decision and the account of what led to that decision, the actual decision itself, and where we're at today. And then we're asking you all to take action afterwards to kind of help push the all-deliberate speed forward. So, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Campbell-Watley, for your great grounding and information of what we'll be discussing today. My name is Gerard Jones. I have the privilege and honor of being the moderator for this afternoon. I'll get myself settled. And today we're actually joined by 4 phenomenal panelists, well known in the education community and the legal system. And we even have one, Brother Neil, you're a member of the church as well, right?
I taught at Sunday school, and he's grounded, and he's smart.
Thank you. Thank you. And so today, as we just discussed, we'll be talking about what led up to the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and even the resegregation of schools, and how the segregation of our schools even leads to some of the stats that you've been exposed to just now. And that's what we're talking about with this cradle to prison pipeline. And so we're thankful for those who joined us last month. If anyone joined us last month, please give yourselves a round of applause for coming out again. And we want to continue pushing this discussion forward to make our congregation and friends of the congregation more aware of some of the factors that's plaguing our communities, is leading to those stats that you've just been exposed to. So without further ado, let's get to some of the experts in the room. Put pressure on y'all. So I want to actually start out today giving you like a flow of what we're doing. So today we have with us to my left, to my left is Mr. Arthur Griffin Jr. Thank you, sir. Mr. Arthur Griffin Jr. is a distinguished himself in 3 areas: business, military, and civic life. He retired as a senior vice president for McGraw-Hill Education in New York. At McGraw-Hill Education, he led a national business development team working with school superintendents and administrators in identifying strategies and solutions to achieve their institutional goals. Mr. Griffin served 17 years on this Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. Please give him a round of applause for serving 17 years, dedicating himself to the betterment of our babies. He led the board as chairman from 1997 to 2002, and he is a nationally recognized resource in the area of public school governance, working to balance the scales of justice. For 20 years, Mr. Griffin worked as a litigation paralegal at the Legal Services of Southern Piedmont. He represented clients before the state and federal administrative law judges in the area of public benefits such as housing, unemployment, and Social Security disability benefits. Mr. Griffin served his country in the United States Army as a soldier and infantry platoon leader in Vietnam, and retired as a lieutenant colonel. Mr. Griffin earned a Bachelor of Science in Liberal Arts from the University of the State of New York at Albany. He and his wife of 42 years, Miss Alicia Elston Griffin, have 2 adult children, Christina and Tony, and 3 grandchildren, Colin, Leah, and Alana. Please give a round of applause for themselves. And beside Mr. Griffin, we have Mr. Attorney Brandon Neal. Attorney Neal is a managing counsel in the Wells Fargo Legal Department, leading a team responsible for all the company's recovery and resolution planning. Pretty sure he's a busy guy. No shade. I used to work at Wells. So among other company initiatives, Neal served as a Wells Fargo nominee on the National Board of Trustees of the National Urban League, the leadership team of the Wells Fargo Young Professionals Network, and served as Wells Fargo's representative member of the 2014 Fellows Program with the Leadership Council on Legal Diversity. Attorney Neal is a native of Charlotte, North Carolina, has a passion for the continued growth and improvement of his home city, state of North Carolina, and urban communities. He currently serves on the Board of Trustees of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library, the Board of Directors of the Batchelor Museum of Modern Art, the boards of the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, and the Duke Law alumni. He and his wife, Kirby, have a daughter and son. Please give a round of applause for Attorney Neal. Next, we have Mr. Justin Perry. Mr. Perry is the owner and therapist at Perry Counseling, Healing, and Recovery, where he specializes in treating individuals who struggle with shame, insecurity, and personal relationships. He has over 14 years of experience with children, adolescents, and adults who have experienced trauma and are managing mental health and substance use disorders. Perry has provided clinical services at Thompson Child and Family Focus, Daymark Recovery Systems, Anuvia Prevention and Recovery, Carolina's Healthcare System, and most recently at Hopeway. Perry is a proud Charlotte native and graduate of the West Charlotte High School. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology and sociology, as well as his master's in social work, all from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He currently serves as the co-chair of a Group 1 MEC, which focuses on increased equity and integration in education and housing. He also serves as a board member and mentor for the Bruce Irons Camp Fund, and as a board member for the Foundation of the Carolinas on the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Foundation Family Stability Committee. Perry was named one of Charlotte Observer's 7 to Watch in 2016. He was also awarded in 2016 UNC School of Social Work Distinguished Alumni Award. Finally, in 2016, he was also selected as a Playing for Others Night of Gratitude honoree and named one of Southern Living Magazine's top 50 Southerners of the year. 2016 was a busy year. He is happily married and father of a 4-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter. I always mess that up.
Yeah, I was like, not 2, not 4.
Yeah, I did it to you last time. And Dr. Dells, I'm sorry. Please give a round of applause for Mr. Justin Gray. I want to give a shout out to Justin Gray as well. Justin Perry as well. He actually did some work with us with Project Lift Schools around trauma-informed care for our social workers and counselors. And so I'm very grateful for the work that you do in the trenches as well. So it's not just on panels, but also helping out educators. Dr. Betty Howell Gray. Dr. Betty Howell Gray dedicates herself to improving the quality of education, quality of life for children, and social issues that address equity and opportunity. Her journey along this road took her through the roles of teacher, principal, director, and currently consultant for the North Carolina affiliates of National Alliance of Black School Educators. North Carolina NASB affiliates offer professional workshops, forums, and conferences designed for My Brother's Keepers initiative to ensure that students are reading by the 3rd grade. This work involves youth of color, parents, teachers, and school leaders in all phases of CMS and the community. She earned a BS degree from North Carolina A&T University, a Master's of Arts, and doctorates from University of Washington and Western Washington University. She is a native of Goldsboro, North Carolina, and retired principal after serving over 38 years in Seattle public schools. Dr. Gray has received numerous awards in the last several years for her work, including the North Carolina Order of the Longleaf Pine. Please join me in giving a round of applause for Dr. Betty Howard. So we'll actually start with Mr. Arthur Griffin. Mr. Arthur Griffin, from what I've known, Mr. Arthur Griffin continues to do excellent work on the front lines as well. Currently the chair of the Black Political Caucus. I'm not sure if we put that in his bio. And he used to chair the, well not chair, I know he was on the board of the Housing Authority. And he continues to help organizations bridge the gap of Housing Authority. And so Mr. Griffin, as a native of Charlotte, could you please give your account of the school system prior to the Brown versus Board of Education decision?
All right, thank you very much. I was asked to share with you a short window of my experience in terms of Brown. I was born in 1948 in an all-black hospital here in Charlotte called GodisGood Hospital. So I went to school my first grade year. They didn't have kindergarten. I was 6 years old, which was 1954, the year which the Brown decision was made. I went to Alexander Street. I lived on 6th Street, downtown Charlotte, a little single shotgun house way before they built Earl Village and everything else down there. And we were assigned to go to Alexander Street, which is down off of 11th Street here in Charlotte. That's where black kids went to. The First Ward Elementary School up on 9th Street was where white kids went to school. White kids lived in the upper part of First Ward. They all went to First Ward Elementary. Black kids lived on down 6th Street, 7th Street, near McDowell Street. They all went to Alexander Street. If you crossed Trade Street, you had to go to Mile Street Elementary. You lived in Brooklyn. So in 1954, I was going to school as a first grade student. Had no clue what Brown versus the Board meant or anything. I was just going to school. School was overcrowded. It was run down. It was old. We had shifts back then, meaning kids went to school from 8 o'clock to 12 noon and then 12 to 4. We always wanted to lobby for the early shift from 8 to 12 because we could play in the afternoon. So sometimes the dice rolled our way and sometimes they did not. We had materials that I had no idea were secondhand and hand-me-down. They had other people's names in them. They had good, bad, poor. They were just materials. I didn't know the difference at that point. Matriculated through Alexander Street as Brown was being implemented. Whites were moving out of the upper part of First Ward. And so in 1958 maybe, they closed my school and we were allowed to go to First Ward because all the whites had moved out. We were still segregated and separated in terms of an all-black elementary school. And then subsequently moving over to Second Ward High School, which was 7th grade to 12th grade. Second Ward is over where the Aquatic Center was right now. That whole area was Brooklyn back in the old days, full of black people. And going to Second Ward was no different than First Ward. I didn't know the difference. I knew that we were getting hand-me-down materials. Didn't really know the politics of why we were getting hand-me-down materials. But as some of you folk who grew up here in Charlotte realized, our schools were paired with white schools. Central Highs, where Central Piedmont is now, is a white school. And their colors are blue and white. Second Ward's colors were blue and white. It dawned on me after becoming an adult that that's where our old uniforms came from. Because when they got new uniforms that were blue and white, they passed the old uniforms down to us at Second Ward. Football, basketball, cheerleading squads, you name it. And didn't know until I was an adult. The same thing happened across town in West Charlotte. Harding High School colors are maroon and gold. And West Charlotte got the hand-me-down during all segregated time. I graduated in 1966 from high school. Julius Chambers came to town, I think, in 64, maybe 62. He filed his first lawsuit in 1965, Swan versus the Board of Education. I'll try to get my 5 minutes here real quick. Swan versus the Board of Education, and then we kind of realized, that was systemic government segregation. The community said we're going to do better. We're going to give the colored schools more resources. And from 65 to 69, they failed to do that. And so juries went back to court in 1969, and that case went all the way through successfully to the Supreme Court, which they said you need to desegregate. The issue was not so much at that time about black and white kids sitting next to each other. The issue back then was providing the resources, because resources followed white kids. Let me fast forward to today in terms of the resegregation of our schools. We've had a number of opportunities for us not to resegregate. Our leadership has simply failed in terms of making sure we had a more desegregated setting. Now keep in mind there were all advocates out there saying that we should segregate. Well, now we've segregated and the resources aren't there. The money just will not follow the kids and follow the needs. There is another important lawsuit out there now that's called Leandro, and Leandro speaks specifically to what you should have if you are a student in schools here in North Carolina. And at some point I'll read to you those 4 attributes of what each child is entitled to, whether you're in a black school, a white school, or a green school. But as I said to you, desegregation is important. Why is it? Where do you learn to be led by people who are different than you? Where do you learn to work with people who are different than you? Some of the beginning stages of that development occurs in our elementary schools and our high schools. If you've ever worked with people who never integrated or worked with people differently after an adult, you recognize the challenges in terms of working cooperatively. So there are a lot of benefits in terms of integration as well as desegregation, but the key thing is to make sure kids get an education, because education provides hope. Most of the things you saw on the panel up there are economic crimes, meaning kids are selling drugs, kids are stealing things, but they're economic crimes. If they had a great education, it wouldn't be a need to do that. They can go out and get a great job and take care of themselves and their family. Thank you.
Thank you. Attorney Neal, so Mr. Griffin gave us kind of perspective leading up to the Board of Education, and also gave us a preview of what we had now. Kind of taking a step back, could you talk to us about talk to us more in depth about the actual lawsuit of the Board versus Brown Education?
Yeah, so first you're going to ask me to follow that? So yeah, I thought about sort of how much detail I would give you guys, and I don't want to put you through a law school class as my son talks over me, which is not unusual. But, you know, I think it's important to know, I have a couple things to take away from leading up to Brown versus Board of Education and after Brown versus Board of Education. A couple of quick points that I'll highlight without taking you through the entire history is I think a lot of people think or have this impression in their mind that the progression on these issues and through history is linear, and it goes up, it's always going up. And that's really not the case. And if you look back in history, it's always a tug and a pull, and a up and a down, a forward and a backwards. And that's the way progression is made. It really very much is 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. And so you see that through history. And so I think it's important to keep that in context as we're in a point right now that seems like we're taking another step backwards. So if you think about Brown versus Board of Education, what really started this, and Sister Gloria, my Sunday school teacher, I'll address some of your points there. So we do have a constitution, but like I tell people, since we're in a church, we also have a Bible. And there are a lot of people proclaiming to follow the Bible who aren't, maybe not interpreted the way we would think Christians would. So it is a document that's written, is contextualized in that point of time, and then it's interpreted. You know, there's not a lot there, and then you add on amendments. And so, yes, we do have amendments that protect us, but again, this interpretation of the laws, and if you look at it right now, we're interpreting what does the Second Amendment mean, right? Is gun ownership in the context of a well-regulated militia, or is there an ultimate right to guns outside of that? So it's always subject to interpretation. There's always Congress who can act laws that may not seem like they're in conjunction with the Constitution. So taking this case law back, you start with Dred Scott versus Sanford, right? And that was the case that really established African Americans as second-class citizens, that they didn't enjoy the same privileges as their white counterparts because of slavery. And so you have that, and then immediately you have a reaction. And again, the one step backwards, two step forward, you have the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Laws that is established to help provide relief. But then you have what's enacted as the Black Codes, which is a precursor to Jim Crow laws that really were passed by Southern governments and restrictions on freedmen. It's kind of what we're seeing today, right? So right to vote was limited. Right to serve on juries was limited. Right to testify, ability to carry, also limited. So some of the same things you're seeing today. Fast forward, you do have some progress. There's a civil rights bill passed. There is the 14th Amendment that's passed that really sets the stage for Brown versus Board of Education. Because this 14th Amendment states that the states can't have to afford you the same rights and privileges as everyone else under law, and there's an equal protection clause that everyone should enjoy equal treatment under the law. And so you fast forward from that, and you get to Plessy versus Ferguson, where it's sort of a pushback in response to the 14th Amendment. You see that it's also in the Jim Crow era, or following Jim Crow era, and really what they say there is that it was it dealt with African Americans on a train car, and if they can be in a separate train car from their white counterparts, as long as it's equal, then being separate necessarily isn't constitutional. And so you see this doctrine being carried forth and applied to all the different aspects of society, schools, restaurants. And so really what you have, this is the other key takeaway I'll tell you. I think a lot of people, at least in my generation, I'm a millennial, think that you march, these cases just happen, but they don't just happen. You look at Thurgood Marshall and his mentor, Charles Hamilton Houston, they were very intentional about the cases they took and the actions they took, right? So when they first were building up to Brown versus Board of Education, they decided to attack graduate schools because they knew you could not prove, and actually the first ones they brought, the cases they brought were law schools, because they knew that you couldn't have separate law schools that would be equal. And they also thought they could appeal to judges who went through the law schools to say, something's not right here. So they started there, and they built their cases, and then you start to see them pick cases throughout. So Brown versus Board of Education, which a lot of people don't realize, is a collaboration of 5 different cases. So it's Brown versus Board of Education, which was a family of, I believe, 13 parents and on behalf of their 20 children who were in Topeka, Kansas, decided they wanted to let their kids go to the integrated school, so they filed suit. But there are also cases, the Briggs case, which is near where my father grew up, down in Clarendon County in South Carolina. So you have them picking a case there. You also have the case of Davis, that's in Virginia. You have 2 cases in Delaware, and then you also have one Bowling that's in D.C. And so really what they did, and I'm talking about the NAACP and the civil rights attorneys, they picked these cases with good cases, good arguments, good plaintiffs, and made it a national issue. And so the Supreme Court, when they decided to hear Brown versus Board of Education, they combined these cases, and they heard this as a national issue. And so Brown versus Board of Education, was a triumph in that it was established that separate but equal as applied to education is inherently unequal or unequal. And so they struck down that Plessy versus Ferguson, that you could have separate but equal. The problem with Brown is that they didn't provide any enforcement powers, right? So we all know that the judicial branch is only responsible for interpreting law. So how are they going to force states to actually go out and desegregate, right? And so they realized that they don't really have any power. So you have this Brown 2, which is a follow-up to Brown, where they try to attempt to create some enforcement powers. But then you carry on, and then you really have to have the cases like Mr. Griffin mentioned, the Swan case, where you say, where the court has said, look, in order for us to really desegregate schools, we're going to mandate busing, right? And you also have the case with Little Rock 9, where that case, I believe it's Aaron versus Cooper, went up to the Supreme Court, and they said, look, the Supreme Court's law is the law of the land. You can no longer have segregated schools. So you had that, and again, so you see the step forward, and then actually another case in Charlotte. So it didn't make it the Supreme Court case, but the Capraccione, I believe it was, he couldn't get his daughter into a magnet school because coming out of the Swan case, the schools were bused. You had busing based on quotas to make sure that you had this desegregation. And because his daughter was declined from being in magnet school twice, he decided to bring a lawsuit, and that really struck down the busing based on race, and so you start to see that unwind, and so that's where we are today. So it's interesting to see, you know, maybe the next phase of this, and maybe I think we talk a lot about how do we desegregate schools and can we do it on a socioeconomic level, but it comes down to you may have to have judicial action to do it. You may have to go back through the court systems. The other thing I'll mention, just to wrap up, I think we put a lot on our schools. I think we try to solve our country's problems in the school. Like, the school is really a symptom, but the school wasn't set up for us to solve segregation. The school wasn't set up for us to solve the social issues that are going on in the community before the kids get to school. And so we put a lot on the schools to do that, and so it'll be interesting to talk through, and I know we have experts over here to do that, but I'll leave it there, and sorry for a long history lesson.
Oh, no, that was excellent. That was excellent. So kind of a segue, too, to the schools kind of being sometimes, quote-unquote, socially engineered to help alleviate society's problems. And so we're going to transition to Justin, but I believe Attorney Neal and Mr. Griffin raised up good points about the work that Julius Chambers did between 65 and 69, is that right? And so there's an excerpt in this article that we provided in the back, as we segue into Justin, that states about busing. And so busing began in Charlotte in September 9th, 1970, with 525 buses serving as the Army of Integration, where white parents protested in Charlotte, which claimed to be the city of the New South, anxiously waited to discover whether its claim was anything more than a clever marketing pitch. And so I'll lead into Justin here because he's Charlottean as well, went through CMS, and had a very diverse experience.
Well, I appreciate you leading this, and I appreciate Friendship taking this on, because I think that it's really important that us and our churches and everybody really involved in these issues. And so for me, it's interesting listening to both Mr. Griffin as well as Brandon, because it feeds into a lot of my own experience. And, you know, he mentioned the Compascione case. I was actually in high school in West Charlotte when that case got brought up, and I was there with some of my peers, and we went to protest because we knew that that case going through would lead us to where we are right now, you know, which is separate and unequal. You know, I think we always hear separate and equal, and that sounds convenient, but we never achieve separate and equal.
Say it again.
And I think that's the thing, and so when we start talking about, we need to get back to, I'm always hesitant because sometimes that's kind of a misleading, kind of romanticizing of something that didn't happen. Now, we were in better shape than I think what our separate is now. But what I can say is that, yeah, the Swan case was a part of my education. I went to Irwin, Piedmont, West Charlotte, and I did have diverse education. And as Mr. Griffin said, it wasn't just about being able to sit by other kids and connect with other kids. That was a great thing, but also had opportunities for a lot of classes that a lot of our schools don't have right now. I mean, I took a lot of AP classes throughout my time, and I go to those schools now that have a handful of AP classes, and those are the schools that hold our kids. And so, for me, I think, you know, the point Mr. Griffin made about the resources tend to follow white kids, that's reality. You know, and I think that's the part we have to hear, but also it's what we have to figure out, how do we advocate for those things on multiple levels. And kind of going to Brandon's piece about it not just being schools, part of the reason my group One Met focuses on housing and education is because those two things work together. Gerard used the term social engineering. Well, our society is built on social engineering. Our neighborhoods didn't live the way they did organically. They use redlining to say, these are desirable folks, these are less desirable folks. The less desirable folks, back when Charlotte segregated after Reconstruction, Negroes and Mexicans. That's what the list says. I mean, think about that, where we are now, Black and Latino. When we talk about concentrated poverty, who's most impacted by that in terms of schools and neighborhoods? Black and Latino. Now, for me, you know, I work as a therapist. As Gerard said, I'm passionate about education as well. My mom was a teacher for 30-some years. I do a couple of groups in West Charlotte right now. One of the things I've looked at is looking at what does concentrated poverty look like in schools. And what we tend to see is we tend to have the least experienced teachers, the least high-level courses. We tend to have high teacher turnover. Also talk about how we have a lot of challenges with concentrated trauma, because a lot of our kids are some of the kids that are dealing with being displaced in terms of housing. You know, all of the different things. So when we see behavior problems, so as a therapist, what I'm supposed to look at is, yeah, I want to recognize the behavior, but I also want to know what's underneath the behavior. All right? And so when I have conversations with kids, I'm having conversations that a lot of people aren't having. So when people say, oh, our kids today are bad, I stop them. You got to be really careful with that language. You know, because again, our kids will internalize that. Now, the flip side is, from my experience, I work with a lot of kids in concentrated poverty, you know, lower income, primarily black and brown, but I've also worked with a lot of kids that are concentrated in affluence that are white. And that's why I know that behavior problems are across the board. It's not just black kids that get in trouble, but we actually have trouble enforced. So when we look at those stats up there, one of the big things that shapes the stats we have are two things. One, I love you talking about the cradle to prison pipeline. Well, school suspensions. School suspensions are huge. What most people don't realize is that when it comes to mandatory suspensions, blacks and whites actually have pretty similar numbers. It's discretionary suspensions. When you're disrespectful, when you have a cell phone, or those things are things that our kids tend to get suspended for. The kids in the other burbs and everything else don't get suspended for. Now, on the flip side of that, as you become adults, let's talk about drugs. The war on drugs. The war on drugs, when it was crack in the inner city, is now a public health epidemic when it's affecting rural and suburban white folks. And I say this as somebody who's treated both. I know who does the most drugs in this community, and I know who does the most time for drugs in this community. And they look exactly the opposite. So I think it's important for us to really be engaged in all of those things. So I'm sorry I can get off on tangents at times, but I think it's really important. We use simple language to try to describe complicated things. And we tend to be the ones that get hurt by that. You know, so when I hear separate but equal, I'm scared. Because I know they're not going to give us equal. The reason why we want you separate is so you don't know what you don't have. You don't realize that your school has 5 AP classes, our school has 40. And the message we say is, well, these kids over here, they can't really handle it. Well, that's funny because the studies they do, even though beat reporters here in town show that our kids that are testing at the level to be quote unquote, you know, ready for higher level classes tend to be the ones who get left behind more so than others. So I think it's really important for us to look at, when we talk about desegregation is about opportunity. That's where it is first and foremost. Now, where the social interaction is important because that's helped me professionally be able to navigate and work with these different places. But the first thing we need to make sure we're doing is that our kids have access to opportunity so that we're not at the bottom of economic mobility, because that's what the crime comes from. Because again, somebody's recruiting our kids, and either they're colleges or there's gangs. But either way, whatever is the most viable, kids are smart. The kids in the burbs, they're not necessarily more driven to education because they are. They see that education is getting their parents money, so it's like, all right, I'm going to do it. Conversely, a lot of our kids that are focused on sports, it's not because they don't care about education, but where do college recruiters come from? They come to watch you play sports. So we have to figure out how do we make it more viable for all of our kids, but also how do we have peers in their classrooms that also have to see that viability as well. So I'll stop for a second.
Thank you. Then we'll transition to Dr. Gray now. Dr. Gray, Justin just mentioned, once we're in the separate but equal system, and one of the factors in a lot of our schools is that we have least experienced teachers and high turnover of teachers. And so with your experience as an educator, but also with the work that you do with the Black Educators Alliance, could you expound on the importance of the Black educator in the classroom, but also how the Brown versus Board of Education decision affected
say is it has to do with leadership. Leadership and valuing education. And if we can think back in the early years of Brown versus the Board of Ed, we had parents that valued education, and they made sure that you were going to do well. And they focused on the strength that you brought to that classroom. Whereas today, we don't have that. We don't have the high expectations for our kids. And I'm thinking that if we had leadership, the principal, going back looking at effective school research, following those guidelines. Following those guidelines, I think that that would help immensely. And from my experience here during these last 7 years, there is a different shift in how we expect kids to learn. We don't expect them to learn. But I'm thinking in terms of leadership, making sure that the principal have an orderly and receptive, caring, and nurturing environment so that kids would want to come into your classes and would want to learn. And even so, sometimes they say the parents. I'm thinking now when we came along, we had the village. We don't have the village now. So we're going to have to become that village in order to help our children. And we do not have that now. We have a lot of the implicit bias. Looking at years back, we're in that maybe we did. Our parents and our teachers and principals made sure that you got a really good education. We know that. And so, but today, I'm not sure that we have that. So we as parents, we have our parents today, people are saying the reason are the parents. Well, we have to train the parents, and that's what we have done with our National Alliance of Black School Educators from their affiliates around the country. We come in and connect with school districts to really provide the professional staff development so that we can teach them what they should be doing, and then also bring in resources for them, volunteers, if you will, professional volunteers that will come in and mentor and tutor the kids in the classroom. But I'm thinking now, you're right, the teachers, we do not have qualified teachers in our schools that really need the help, and that would be the 40% of the kids that are not making it here. And I'm still trying to figure out now how we have a system here in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, wherein that you have most of your qualified teachers are over in the South End rather than being in the Central End. So sometimes we as a community need to really take a more active role to know exactly what's going on in our schools, lobbying also with local, state, and federal government to make sure that we have the resources that we can supplement those resources and make sure that we have adequate resources for them to do better. Another thing I think too is separate but equal. We know that our teachers really focused and made sure that we got the very best. I'm thinking in terms of reading and writing. They work with the whole child, the social and emotional issues of the kids. We don't have that today because we have teachers that when they first come in, we look at the suspensions and all that, and it's more or less when they tick the teacher off or they tick the principal off, is that you get suspended. So we're looking at changing that, and we're really coming to our community to really ask our community to help us. I don't know if you've heard about the ESSA law. We had the reauthorization of ESSA from NICOB. In other words, ESSA, Every Student Succeed Act, and that replaces No Child Left Behind. Right now, we have that law in place, and we have all of the states should have submitted their plan in how they're going to look at the subgroups. That means the kids of color, the Latino and Black kids, how they're going to come up with a plan in order to have those kids to experience a better success. Interestingly enough, those state plans were submitted by September, but Charlotte-Mecklenburg, or we could say North Carolina State Plan, has still not been submitted, and we're still wondering why. And I think the holdup is that we have not come to the realization of what we're going to do with our kids. You know, early on that we came up with that House Bill 1080, wherein that was taking all of our failing schools, placing those in one zone. We are thinking that is the plan that the North Carolina came up with. And because there has to be engagement and with the community. And we know that the parents and the community have not been engaged in that process. So we have on June 16th, there's going to be a meeting here in Charlotte over at East Stonewall Church. And we have representatives from Education Trust out of Washington, D.C., and representatives in Raleigh that's going to really come in to give us kind of an overview of what's going on with that. But I'm thinking that we have the laws and we know what the laws are. We know what they're supposed to be doing. And it's going to really be up to the communities to really make some noise to our legislators in order to make sure that we get what we're supposed to have for our children.
Thank you. I'm going to pose a question to try to hit a few of our panelists, but then we're going to open it up to the audience to ask if any attendees would like to pose a question as well. You all should have received a question card. You have a question card yet? We have a question card one of our social justice ministry folks can hold up?
Yes.
Okay. You will receive a question card, so please pass. If you have a question that you want to raise to the panel, please raise it up with the question card. And they're passing it out now. So I want to raise a question to Justin in regards to something you said about how, and to Attorney Neal, in regards to how the school sometimes has to help alleviate society's problems. We put a lot of onus to our schools. So I wanted to raise up something from that article again. I'm mentioning this article. This article is in Newsweek, I believe, about the school segregation in America is as bad as today as it was in the 1960s. And this national article actually raised up Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools as kind of the prime example in the nation for this problem of resegregation of our school systems. And so that's why it's like it's a national issue, but it's really a real local issue for those of us who live in Charlotte. And so I wanted to raise up a question about the Charlotte community and how it actually kind of impacts our schools. And so in the article, it mentions the Keith Lamont Scott killing. So it says, after the Scott killing, the sociologist Clint Smith, who wrote in the New Yorker that we cannot disentangle the state-sanctioned school resegregation that poor black students in Charlotte experienced from the police killing of a black man waiting for his son to get off the bus from elementary school. So Justin, in your work this is actually open to anyone on the panel, but in your work, how do these events take a toll on black students in Charlotte?
It's a good question. I think one of the things, again, when we talk about segregation, and I think we're talking about a double level of segregation. We're talking about racial and economic segregation. I think one of the things we have to look at is that our communities tend to get policed differently. Our folks tend to get policed differently, and so there tends to be, even in the event a lot of this, there's a lot of trauma. Even just literally the fact that you hear kids talk about not becoming a hashtag. I mean, if you think about that for a second, the fact that that's a thing, the idea that I could become a hashtag, and so the same way, and for those people who may not get that reference, what that's talking about is police killings. And so not becoming a hashtag means hopefully not being another black male or female gunned down and killed by police that the news cycle looks at for maybe 24 hours. To me, I think a lot of this stuff was brewing, and so when I think Michael Brown's situation came up before, one of the things they looked at in Ferguson has a district called Normandy, and Normandy is actually a district that we talk about, that concentrated poverty, all black and brown, gets that there's a dehumanization that happens when we don't see each other. You know, when if I don't see anybody who looks different than me, then we might as well be in foreign countries. And I think what you saw with the Keith Lamont Scott situation, I can still remember that vividly because I was supposed to go down to the Levine Museum that night because they were doing something about school desegregation, and they closed it. I mean, they shut it down because uptown was like, we got to get everybody out of here. And so I went ahead and I was going to protest. And one of the things that I can still remember is there was a guy out in the audience that had a bullhorn, and he said, you guys want to talk about us, you want to talk about failing schools, well, but you don't want to talk about the fact that we're separated in schools that don't have the same resources. We're separated away from everybody else. And to me, I think what that was, it was about police brutality, but it was also about this prosperous city that we call Charlotte. It has a lot of people who never get to eat at the restaurant. And so we see all the ribbon cuttings and all the businesses that are happening, but they also, everybody sees that all of a sudden the neighborhood that I lived in for 20 years, because you didn't want to live there, now you want to live there, and now you have to go, right? And so there's so many layers to this stuff, and again, I think we have to understand that schools and housing are intersected. It's a real estate game. That's what a lot of this stuff is about too. People are about resale values, and so to me, the segregation, the pain that came out was a result of what's happened in the last couple of decades here. This community has become even more separate, but the haves and have-nots, the gap is growing even wider and wider.
Yeah, and I'll just echo on that too. I would say, to my comment I made earlier, I'm glad Justin mentioned housing, because in my mind, what desegregation of schools is trying to do is solve for the problem that we live in segregated communities, right? Because if you lived in desegregated communities, then you wouldn't have to worry about desegregated schools or busing and this social engineering. But the neighborhoods were very intentionally set up the way they were, and so that's one of the issues. To get to your question, Jared, that's a great question. I would say the common theme is benefit of the doubt, right? And it's something that, as African-American males in particular, you don't necessarily get. So it starts when we talked about in schools and the discretionary suspensions. And it's the same discretionary enforcement that you have when you get into law enforcement, and whether it be traffic stops. You know, it always baffles me. We had another tragic school shooting recently, and it baffles me how the shooter in those situations can be neutralized without being killed. And they have weapons upon weapons upon weapons. But someone who just has a cell phone or a weapon who's not killing people or hasn't killed people can be killed mistakenly. It baffles me, and I think it goes to the benefit of the doubt, right? And it goes back to not being, and I wouldn't even say all of it's intentional. And I think in our schools, if you look about who are the major or what is the primary demographic of our school teachers? And I think, I don't have the stats, but correct me, Dr. Gray, I believe it's white women. So if you think about, you run a Venn diagram about the similarities between the teacher and the student. So at least the white students, even the white boy students, they share in common their whiteness. The black girls, because you would think double standard in a male-dominated society, that black girls would have it worse. But if you think about it, they share the female characteristic with the teachers. So the teachers can a little bit more identify. But the black boy, if you don't interact with black boys and realize kind of their passion, their energy, you have no chance of understanding that boy. You might write it off as bad. And so they don't get the benefit of the doubt there. So there's a lot of implicit bias that's hard to fix, and it's exacerbated by the fact that we don't interact with each other. We don't get to know each other. We hear things on news and write people off as that's a black person, a thug, or even on the other side, that's a Trump supporter, right? Because we don't interact with them. We don't have to. That's the way that our society works, and it's very dangerous. And so I think when you see Keith Lamont Scott, you see someone not getting the benefit of the doubt. So I'll stop there.
And also, I want to add to that is that we have given an action plan to the superintendent on what we feel should be an action plan for implicit bias training. And until we do that, we're going to continue to talk about this over and over again. So it seems to me that they are simply reluctant in having these sessions so staff can really talk openly, have courageous conversations, and discuss some of these issues that we're talking about. So that's where we need our community churches to come in to help us to really, because when you make noise about anything, you get action. We had another issue over at one of the schools here in Charlotte, in that the principal had taken out the choir, the choir. So I had a group of parents that called me about it. So I'm saying, I called the principal and I said, well, have you thought, I guess it's only 65 kids. And they said that they didn't have the funds for that. I said, but rather than just dropping the choir, have you thought about checking out another choir in that area so you could bust those kids? Because are you familiar with the research that tells us that when kids take art and music, they do better on the standardized tests? And so we are coming in, we as a community can come in to help them. And guess what? They thought about that, and the choir is going to be not to another school, it's going to be in that school. But that was the noise that we made because the parents came to me. So we are constantly having parent forums to talk with parents to tell them how much power they have. They can move mountains and the parents can do it more so than us, the teachers. I guess we have done a lot here in the city in these last several years to make sure that they are listening to us. It can change, believe me, it can change, but we need all of us working together in order to do that.
Yeah, just to follow up, two things. I retired twice, and so I'm back out here to chair the Black Political Caucus. The purpose of that is trying to get us voting. 18% of us vote. There are 233,764 African Americans registered to vote in Mecklenburg County as of January the 1st of this year. And we can't get hardly 20% of them out to vote. I ask each of you in here to reach out to your neighbors, your cousins, your friends, your people you don't like. Get them to vote, because this is public policy decisions that we're talking about up here. The next thing I want to do, I'm going to read something to you. I shouldn't do that, but I'm going to read it to you because I want you to look it up on Google. It's the Leandro Court decision. Every child in North Carolina has a constitutional right to these things: a sufficient ability to read, write, and speak the English language, and a sufficient knowledge of fundamental mathematics and physical science, and to enable the student to function in a complex and rapidly changing society. Second, sufficient fundamental knowledge of geography, history, and basic economics and political systems to enable the student to make informed choices with regard to issues that affect the students personally or affect the student's community, state, and nation. Third, sufficient academic and vocational skills to enable the student to successfully engage in post-secondary education or vocational training. And fourth and finally, sufficient academic and vocational skills to enable the student to compete on an equal basis with others in further formal education or gainful employment in contemporary society. These four characteristics is the best state Supreme Court decision out of 39 Supreme Court decisions in this nation. North Carolina Supreme Court did not say give the schools more money, like the other 38 states said. They actually defined, they articulated what every student is entitled to, their constitutional rights in North Carolina. So it's quantitative and qualitative in terms of what every student has a constitutional right to. This lawsuit was filed in 1994, and they're still trying to implement it. The lawsuit, the Supreme Court said there were three things in North Carolina. North Carolina, in March of this year, the Supreme Court of North Carolina said, state, you fail to provide a sound basic education because there's no evidence that our children are experiencing and being provided these characteristics and opportunity to get this type of education. So what I want you to do is to give me a plan so that there is a highly qualified teacher in every classroom. I want you to give me a plan that there's a highly qualified principal in every school. And I want you to give me a plan and tell me the resources necessary to make that happen. And you need to do it by March of 2019 during the long session. That's why I said voting. No other state has said this is what every child is entitled to. We talk about college and career training. This defines what a college or career. It says you can compete at the community college level, or four-year institution, university level, or you can go out and get a job. So that's why you have to vote to make sure that legislators are empowered to make sure that the resources are available for kids to get this type of education. Now, the quick points I'm going to make is, when Kaepernick filed that lawsuit, he sued me. So I know that lawsuit very well. This was a white parent who wanted to go to another school down the street just to raise havoc here in Mecklenburg County, because the school that the kid was going to, McAlpine, the test scores were higher than the school that he wanted to go to. He just wanted to file a lawsuit. And so we went through several trials, but this is what the courts decided, which is contrary to what some people believe. The courts didn't say busing was illegal in Mecklenburg County. The courts, by a vote of 6-5, said that you were unitary. We had never had that designation before. That simply means you have rid yourself of the vestiges of a dual system. We could have continued to bus in Mecklenburg County, but the politics wasn't here to do that. That's number one. The next point is black teachers. Black teachers were fundamental when I was going to school at Alexander Street, because I had to get up and get my knuckles rammed with a ruler to diagram sentences. I don't even know if people even diagram sentences anymore. Okay? But we had to do that. So we had excellent teachers back then. Okay? The one step forward and two steps backwards. If we don't stay, just like the Brown decision, Leandro in March of 2019 is going to be resolved one way or the other. It's either going to go by the wayside and we won't have these characteristics, or we're going to step forward. That's why you need to be engaged. Something I learned with my grandchildren is called dispersal. You talked about suspensions and exclusions. Well, you won't read the data anymore because they just move kids around in the school. Okay? They just move you from classroom to classroom and call dispersal. Never heard of this assembly before until this year. Then parent involvement, parent support. We can get parent support if we want to get parent support. Don't tell me you can't get parent support. You can get parent support. And think about choice. When all the Brown decisions came up in Brown 2 by all deliberate speed, people that you know in the history books, Sam Irvin, Jay Fulbright. Some of y'all might have Fulbright scholarships. I don't say that too loud, okay? From Arkansas. A series of white legislators in 1957 came together and said, hey, we're going to come up with the Southern Manifesto. We're going to do everything we can do to make sure that Brown fails. You have people out there right now in legislative positions wanting Leandro to fail because they understand the consequences and the implications of Leandro. So stay tuned, stay involved, and definitely vote. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's kind of sticking with you for a quick moment. As one question was raised, as the leader of the BP's Black Political Caucus, it is clear you are very aware of how voting impacts these issues. So what is the BPC doing to vet and align itself with candidates who are clearly in line with the social issues?
I've been chair for almost 4 months now of the Black Political Caucus, coming out of retirement. And one of the things I've noticed is that we elect people that aren't accountable to us. Okay? So the first thing we're going to try to do is start asking the right questions of those. But it's not just the Black Political Caucus. You need to hold your representative. If they look like me or otherwise, hold them accountable. But our meeting at 6 o'clock tonight, the Black Political Caucus will have the 4 at-large city council people, and we're going to specifically ask them questions about affordable housing, not in a generic sense, but specifically, are you committed to a policy that the public can see before you put the bond referendum out before the public to vote on in November? The second piece deals with economic development. We give a lot of grants in this town to businesses, and we don't require them to work with Goodwill. We don't require them to work with Urban League. We don't require them to do a lot of things in terms of upward mobility. What we do, we research and pass a research policy and put research on the shelf about upward mobility. That has zero capacity to be implemented until you get legislators who are willing to deal with policy. The other one deals with public safety, trying to have law enforcement people who are sensitive to all the citizens of Mecklenburg County, and finally, youth. We always reach out to schools about youth, but the youth belong to all of us. city council, county commission, and school board, and we have to create the kind of healthy community for kids to be successful. So what's BPC going to do? From now forth, we're going to have different groups of elected officials coming before us. We're going to ask them questions, but not just the BPC. You need to ask those elected officials questions that are specific to the needs of the African American community. And we've never had as many African Americans elected to office in Mecklenburg County. In fact, when I grew up here, there were no black people elected to any office.
Say it again.
So this question is to any of the panelists. So please speak to Dr. King's comment of, I think on integration, I've led my people to a burning house/building.
I'll speak to that. I think what he saw was that the Southern Manifesto, as I just said, is from Georgia, that those Southern senators and representatives did everything they could do to make sure that desegregation failed. And I think he saw an awakening that maybe our kids, for example, when I got involved in legal services, I got involved in education because although we went to court and got something passed called Givens versus Poe, which was a lawsuit that provided due process for kids who were being disciplined, we still had kids being kicked out of school without due process. And we still had kids fighting. So, Mr. Jones, I think when people saw what was happening in the early 70s as it relates to school desegregation, he saw a picture that wasn't very pretty. He just didn't see the end of that picture.
Yeah, I guess I'll add something real quick and I'll kick over to them. I think part of it too goes back to a lot of us sitting in this room, right, with integration. It gave those who had the means to take advantage of certain opportunities to leave others behind. And so I think that, I don't know if that's what Dr. King was envisioning, if he could see that far ahead, but it's certainly been an unintended consequence, right? So a lot of us who can be in the community and help these parents to develop and build that community that we had, that my parents had, that my grandparents had, no matter who you were, you know, there were some people that were doctors, lawyers in the community that will pick you up in the Second Ward, doctors, lawyers who could help those. I think that has been an unintended consequence, and so we as African Americans who can move out. And so not only do you now have separate, you also have separate but not equal, but then you took those who could help pull the others out of that community. So it just builds on top, snowballs on top of each other.
I was definitely going to speak to that point. I think it was two layers. I think some of King stated that also came, if I'm not mistaken, after he had experience in Chicago. And so I think one of the things was we recognize the issues of the South, but a lot of us are blind to the realities of the North and the Midwest. And the thing about Capacione came down here from New Jersey, you know, one of the most segregated school districts in the nation. When you look at Detroit, you look at Chicago, you look at New York, these are the most segregated parts of the country, but because of another thing about Brown is Brown only touched de facto, which meant written in law segregation. It didn't hit de jure. So when you look at what's happening right now with Matthews and Mint Hill and all trying to create their separate, they've gotten hip to doing it the way they do it in the North with municipalities and townships. So that way the law doesn't touch it the same way. And so I think it was two layers of realizing that, wow, man, the South is bad. Man, there's a whole other beast up there. But then I think, to your point, Brandon, I think that's one of the things I look at, because often when I hear folks talk about, hey, we can do it on our own, a lot of times the people I hear saying that are upper middle class black folks who are going to be amongst other upper middle class black folks and are leaving a lot of our folks who don't have the same resources behind. And so I'm saying we got to, and I'm the type, I probably upset a lot of people because I'm going to just speak it, the reality I see. And so, you know, I've had people say to me, well, you don't have to worry about your kid. You can get them to school, whatever. And I'm like, this ain't about me trying to beat the system. This is about me trying to figure out how to work the system so we don't have to beat it. You know? And so I think that's the pieces. So a lot of us in these churches, in our churches, we figure out how to make it, but we can't just say, hey, I got mine. I got to make sure that my brother's keeper, that I'm making sure that he and she are getting theirs as well.
That's what we have. So I've experienced so much of that here. And even when a lot of parents feel that when they send their kids to an all-white school, they're getting a great education. They really feel that. lobbying with the county commissioners, lobbying with your school board, lobbying with your legislators in Raleigh, because that's where the action is. I'm still working now with our county commissioners and the city council, because what Washington State has done in Seattle, they lobby the members in the community. 1% from all of the people that sell sweet products, and they 1%, and they were able from that 1%. So that would be calculated maybe with every person in the community, maybe $30 maybe for all of the people in the community, and they were able to get enough funds to have literacy centers all around the Seattle area. And I keep talking with our city council here to see, can we do that here? But they are telling me they can't because of some laws or some, those extremist laws in Raleigh. So we're asking them, we're going to be working with them to see how can we do something here, since we know that we have that 39% and 40% of our kids are not reading. And we think we need to have that here. We also have the Cry Out Now. You know about Charlotte Reed is doing a fabulous job in working with that 39% to 40%. And so we need a lot of volunteers for that program. But I'm saying, make sure you're active in lobbying and be there, show up in these meetings, and they're quite once a month, in some cases twice a month. So that's what I'm advocating for all the parents to do. Even though we can really talk, and I know that we've really been talking about the data. I know the data drives our decisions that we make on certain issues, but we really have got to get out there and just really fight and to make sure these things happen, to make the rhetoric a reality. So we just need the community, and we are just pleading to the community. Because I was shocked, because we have a lot of we have a lot of press conferences to talk with the community. For instance, I don't think that several years ago that the community knew that we had 19,000 African American males were suspended compared to our 2,000 white males. And I just don't think, because I'm thinking that the community would be up and alarmed about that. So that's the work that we do, is lobbying and making sure that that information gets out to the community.
Thank you, Dr. Gray.
Thank you.
So in the spirit of, friendship, to our own a little bit. So recently started our own school, a K2 school. I believe it's a focus on science and the arts. And so this question kind of reminds me of this, and I'm going to pose this to you all. Do you think that black people have such low self-esteem or belief in their capability to teach our own that we would rather serve children up to the system that fails them time and time again?
Well, philosophically, I would agree with you. I think African American people have enormous capacity and will to do what's right. As a practical matter, I don't see where it's happening anywhere in terms of scale. I point you to Philadelphia. I point you to Detroit. I can point you to Jackson, Mississippi. I can point you to a lot of different schools that are about 99% black. So the question of desegregation is not even on the table. And we're still not doing what we need to do for our kids. I have relatives that left Charlotte to go to Allen. If anybody been around, Allen up in Ashford, used to be an all-black girls' school. When school desegregation occurred here, my wife went to Our Lady of Consolation, which is a Catholic school. So the elite African Americans back in the day always found a way. But we're talking about the 99% of the other African Americans, and what are we going to do to provide for them for a great education? And so I say this to add on to this, where sometimes it seems like we're bad-mouthing education. We need to encourage and lift up education so that some of our babies will go into education and become teachers. Because we can complain, yeah, there's 17% of African American teachers versus 83% of non-African American teachers nationwide. And it's about the same here in Mecklenburg County. So we have to lift up education, because you all got a good education out there from a teacher, and I got a great education. So let's complain but also embrace and support African American educators so that other young African Americans will go into teaching, because otherwise our kids are going to go somewhere else other than the classroom, and we need our teachers to be in the classroom.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. That's where I was going to go. So there is, and part of that issue, right, is there is a wealth arms race going on in this city, in our country right now, right? And there is opportunity where the disparities between the top 10-ish to 20%, they're just pulling away from the bottom 90%. And country, both, everywhere. And so what you see is, and why you see that, African Americans, especially those who, let's just say, made it, they know that they don't have the safety net of others. And so it kind of goes back to the point Justin was making earlier, with the kids looking up to who they see making it. And so I think a lot of times it's easy for our African American middle class folks to look at the model that they see make it, and if I send my kid to this white school, they're going to have a better chance of success. Or parents telling kids, no, don't go be a teacher, go be an investment banker or a lawyer so you can make money, because that's what really you need to do. And so we have a lot of that going on. And so I think that gets to your question of why you see the impacts that it does. But one of the things that I'll combat with that is there was a recent study, you should all go read it. It's the same guy who did Chetty, who was working on the social mobility in Charlotte. But it was in the New York Times, and it talks about African American males and wealth, and how most of the people who are wealthy, they stick there over generations, right? They stick there. It's hard. Your sons, your grandchildren, they'll continue to be wealthy. But for African American males in particular, just because you're wealthy and my daughter's walking in, doesn't mean that, or my son more so, doesn't mean that he's going to be wealthy. He's more likely to fall back down into poverty. And so it's a very interesting dynamic that we have to change these systems to keep that from being so. But you see a lot of that risk aversion, and they think that the solution is to go to the white school as opposed to kind of going to a black school, because they haven't necessarily seen that model replicate.
I was going to say real quick to the question you had about, whether it's about our self-esteem. I mean, I think that our self-esteem, obviously, this nation has been built to try to beat it down. There's no way around that. All right? But I also think, in a way, sometimes we get kind of these false dichotomies. So it's like either I do it myself or I serve it up to the system. Well, I think going back to Mr. Griffin's point about the 18% of us voting, how about we hold the system accountable for once? So again, in this state of North Carolina, we actually have a constitutional right that is different than anywhere else in this nation. And so the work is, when we look at our legislation at the state right now, and I can just say these things, I represent me, not friendship, so I don't know everything else, but I mean, we have legislatures that are trying to destroy public education. That is point blank what they're doing. Their goal is to tear it apart so that they can have more tax money, and they will send our kids to prison like they do in New Orleans and places like that. So again, certain words sound nice like choice and everything else, but you got to look deeper. You got to know things like ALEC. I'll tell y'all, Google that when you go home. There's a systematic plan right now to make the schools fail so that they can defund them and funnel it into another model, that's a charter model, where they suspend even easier and then have our kids in prison. All right, so I think it's really important that 18%, that's unacceptable. We had too many people who fought for us to be able to vote. And it's not enough to say my vote doesn't count. My vote doesn't count because I'm not making it count. And so again, we got a lot of folks, like you said, right now we're more represented by black folks in the city than ever, but we got to hold them accountable. Because all same skin folk ain't kin folk. All right? So I got to make sure that if I get folks elected, once you're in there, you can't just uphold the system and say, oh man, well, the white people are going to let me do it. Well, white people, look around you. Like, there's more of us, so what are you actually standing for? Don't come into a forum and represent yourself one way, but then vote a different way when you're behind closed doors. So again, it's not about choosing the system or choosing ourselves. It's about choosing ourselves and owning our part in upholding the system.
I'm sorry, we are going off the call. So next question. So as a senior citizen with grown, successful children, how can I help with keeping black boys being railroaded into jail simply because they're black and poor? within the system that we're working in.
You got the senior citizen up there. I'll follow.
Education and training. I think education and training is going to be the big piece of that, along with leadership, who's working and leading our children. I think that's the part that I would say, leadership and training. And then also focusing on the strengths of our kids. Many of our students are so brilliant, but we beat them down because we don't have high expectations for them. And so I'm saying that we got to start thinking in terms of that, is making sure that they come and you focus on the strengths that they bring to the class, and then you can correct the negative so that they won't turn to with the negativity and want to do the things that's going to get them in trouble.
What I do as a senior citizen, retired, grown kids and grandkids, I volunteer twice a week at elementary school. I work with some young black girls and young black boys, and right now they're in the EOG prep, so I'm not there, but I'll be doing that as soon as the bell sounds in August. It's going right back to volunteering twice a day.
Try to leave them a little bit of wealth and not debt.
Say, just quickly, I would say, teach the same lesson my mom taught me, that the world's not fair, but you can overcome it. All right, I think sometimes the challenge is things that Dr. Gray and Mr. Griffin went through were more out in the open than some of the stuff that we go through. But make sure you don't necessarily downplay what your kids are going through. Don't tell them, hey, you guys got it way easier. Tell them, the same stuff is not fair. But at the same time, you know what, this is what we're given, we're going to work through it together. So.
And last
Also, the mentoring, tutoring. I forgot to mention that. Mentoring, tutoring, and choose a school, adopt a school, and get other people to come into the school to really work with the kids is a wonderful option.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. So the last question, and this kind of going to help us segue into our next portion. I might have lost my question. So it's kind of merging the two questions together. So we seem to know much of what is causing the problems, of what we can do to start. What can we do to start? We seem to know much of what is causing the problems. What can we do to start to come up with some real solutions? And for our topic today, what can be done to alleviate the integration, the resegregation of the CMS schools? So I know I chopped it up, so we're not going to repeat it.
The segregation is, like everybody up here said, it's based on your housing patterns right now, because you go to your neighborhood school, other than magnet schools where you're bused to go. When Judge McMillan signed his order, I don't know if Brandon's a lawyer, you go back to 1969, when Judge McMillan signed his order, one of the documents in the back of his order said build midpoint schools. He said that the dynamics, the community's going to grow. And certainly since 1969, Charlotte has grown. But he had the wisdom to say, hey, look, so that the burden is not on white kids and the burden is not on black kids, let's build some midpoint schools so kids won't have to go across town, they go to their closest school. But we failed to do that. So in terms of what do you do now, you try to make sure as Charlotte grows that you have diversity of housing. Diverse price housing is what Braxton tells me I need to say, as opposed to affordable housing. So have affordable housing spread all over the community, and then that would help in terms of school desegregation without the burden being on any one particular kid. The next thing is elect people. Elect people who will have goals. I just read to you something that's very specific and tangible that you can touch and feel. Right now, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education has no goals. No specifics in terms of what % of our children we want to have complete advanced placement courses by the time they graduate. What % of our children we want them to be at level 4 and level 5. Why level 4 and level 5? If your parents out there, read your report card. On the back of it, it says, are you level 3? Are you career and college ready? It says big old capital no. If you're level 4 and 5, it says big old capital yes. So have your school board to articulate several written goals that the public can embrace. So whether I'm on the school board or Brandon's on the school board, the community has embraced these goals, and we're all going to work for those collectively. When I chaired the Board of Education, go back and look at the record. We had specific numerical goals that you held me responsible for and that I held the superintendent responsible for.
So we're probably all going to say different things, and I think it's all of the above. I think we had to do it all coordinated and very intentional and strategic. Since I come from the financial industry, I'm going to do a little bit different. I'm going to say we had to do a better job of creating wealth within our own communities and spending wealth within our own communities and business ownership. And it's okay if you want to go make money, that's fine. But you got to make sure that you help bring that wealth back into the community, because that's what a lot of other cultures have done to really pick themselves up. And if you just look at the spending power of African Americans, I mean, I'm going to use the Black Panther movie as an example. The strength that we were able to show there, just imagine if you could do that on the West Side with businesses, with business ownership, right? And if you go back to some of the stats, if you wonder why the majority of people are sitting in jail that haven't been convicted, well, they can't post bail or bonds. And so that's the way the system works, where white counterparts or those who with means can say they can post bail and bond. But if you don't have resources, just a simple traffic violation or child support will keep you in jail. So I think it very much is figuring out how we can continue to grow wealth within the communities who need it. I would say right now, definitely need to look at sort of how we preserve land as urban sprawl and gentrification happens, as it makes its way up Beatties Ford. Sort of what is the role of friendship and others in preserving some of the affordability and creating the communities we want to see that can be a part of that. So that's sort of what I think we can try to do to combat some of this.
And I would add to that, and I would also say that if we have a plan like Mr. Griffin has indicated that we're going to propose to the board, whatever that plan is, make sure that you have a detailed monitoring system in with that plan, that you can go back and call their attention to it. You've got to monitor it. Ask the right questions.
Everybody's brought up a lot of the key points. I definitely, a lot of my focus again is on housing and education. From the housing standpoint, again, making sure that we're preserving neighborhoods, educate folks on predatory, not even just lending, but also purchasing. When you see we buy houses, buy cash, and everything else, what that's telling you is your land is about to be valuable. So they're trying to get you on the cheap. So you got to educate our seniors and everybody else too. Sometimes we feel like, oh man, I can sell my house for $250,000, but I bought it for $50,000. Well, the thing is, yeah, when you sell it, but now your $250,000 doesn't go where it went when you bought it. You got to move way out, and you're not going to be able to get to your job and everything else. So we got to have that kind of financial literacy. Education-wise, in terms of the resegregation, I think there's a couple of things. One, I'm keep coming back to that state legislature. We have to do something about that serious, because again, that lifting the cap off of charter schools and everything else, charters are the way we use to segregate schools now.
Yes.
Now people used to have to fly through private schools. People don't have to pay for private schools now. They get the state to pay for them.
Right.
So again, when you have folks that are again, I'm not across the board anti-charter. That's not what I'm saying. I am let's just make everything a charter school, because when I look at Detroit, when I look at New Orleans, the places that have done that there, it falls on our backs. All right, so I think we got to be very smart and make sure we're electing the right folks as far as that goes. In terms of in the schools locally, to me, I think there's a couple of things we want to look at. One is making sure what classes are being offered in each school.
Exactly.
I want to promote, get CMS to find transparency. Let's list it. Because one of the reasons why you find some of the numbers being the way they are, well, certain kids know that I can't get this class over here, I guess I'm going to go to school over here. And so again, the more that we can have more equity in terms of class offerings, that will have a big impact. When Mr. Griffin was our chair back when I was in school, there were AP classes throughout the different schools.
Exactly.
All right, now, like I said, when you have that gap like that, well, of course you're going to have overcrowding in the South schools. You got 40 AP classes there. Well, you only got 5 over here. Well, everybody's so again, we gotta figure out how to make sure we have equitable offerings in our schools. I think that also will play a significant role in having greater balance. But that and kind of recapping the charters, because our neighborhoods are becoming actually probably more diverse now than they